everybody, how you doing? My name is Barack Little. I'm checking in, strength coach, personal trainer, and most importantly here to help you pass the CSCS as quick as possible. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe. Below, you can see it, Show Up Fitness. Me and Chris, owner of Show Up Fitness, we're helping you pass the CSCS exam as quick as possible. We're gonna have detailed videos, but you can also sign up for our class. We do 2 times a week. And we also have a study guide with over 200 questions and also just flashcards and notes to really help you condense and not spend too much time reading and overthinking things. Going to condense into the things that are most important to know, and also in just more easier ways to read, and sometimes the book might exhibit to you. Today we're going to actually go over chapter 17 of the book. Very important chapter, one of the more important chapters if you're kind of ranking them. We're talking about resistance training program design variables and just ultimately prescription for anaerobic, or basically a resistance training program. So program design for resistance training is going to be very important, obviously, because it's a lot of steps and a lot of things that are involved when you're talking about programming. This ties directly into periodization, but before you're getting into the kind of periodization and long-term stuff, first and foremost, you need to understand just the basics. And the kind of 7 variables that you need to make sure you understand in this chapter it talks about is going to be needs analysis, exercise selection, training frequency, exercise order, training load and repetitions, then volume, and then ultimately rest periods. So these design variables, these acute variables are all going to go in together when designing a program for your athletes. So it's important to make sure you know all of these. Before we get too into detail in those, we'll just go to some of the basic principles of program design and why we know it. Some of these are kind of touched on in chapter 4, the general adaptation syndrome, but we'll just kind of review those quickly before we we get into everything. So first is just specificity, or more times than not, you might also hear the SAID principle. So SAID stands for specific adaptation to imposed demands, SAID. Ultimately, specificity is going to be very important when training athletes because we need to make sure that they're doing something that's relevant to their sport. For example, if we have a power athlete, let's say a football player, we don't need to be training them to focus mainly on endurance, because that's not what they're doing. Their plays are anywhere from 3 to 5 seconds at a time typically, and they need to be powerful anaerobic athletes. And the same thing in reverse. If we have an endurance runner or a marathon runner, then max power probably isn't going to be at the forefront of their focus. It's going to be more endurance-based anaerobic activity. And then overload, ultimately overload and progression. It goes back to the general adaptation syndrome. The only way our athletes are going to continue to keep progressing is if we're properly overloading them, but overloading them to a set and strategic point where they're not getting into that exhaustion phase. So it's ultimately making sure they stay in that kind of alarm and resistance phase, continuing to super compensate so they can ultimately continue to progress so they don't get into exhaustion. So that's where we're going to be very important as strength coaches, making sure we are able to continue overloading properly, progressing properly, but also recovering properly as one of those acute variables I mentioned. So going into the needs analysis evaluation, there are a lot of things to do here. This is ultimately evaluating the sport and the athlete. What takes place in this sport? I know if I have a basketball athlete, I need to think of some of the things that are going to be involved here. We know the shooting, obviously, that's going to be some elbow extension, it's going to be some shoulder work. We know rebounding, same thing, overhead ability, but also they need to be able to jump, move laterally. So we know a lot of core, hips, and glutes are involved, and obviously speed, agility, and both anaerobic and aerobic components, because basketball is you have to be quick and powerful, but you also need to be able to go a full game. It's a lot of back and forth. Looking at movement versus physiological, and then injury analysis. So you have 3 different types of things here. You have your movement analysis, kind of as I touched on, like the body and limb movement patterns. Then you have physiological analysis, which would be like strength, power, hypertrophy, and muscular endurance priorities. Are we going to prioritize, strength and power first, or are we going to prioritize endurance first? Usually both those things aren't going to be prioritized. Again, a sport like soccer, both need to happen, but you're still going to usually prioritize one. And then injury analysis, ultimately common sites for muscle injury and causative factors. As I mentioned with a basketball player, a common injury, you have a lot of knee, hamstring injuries. So we want to make sure, especially the muscles around those joints are going to be very are strong, stable and mobile as well. So that's going to be very important with needs analysis. Also, you need to know their training status and level. A beginner is not going to be able to do as much as somebody advanced. There's going to be different, levels of progression you can have depending on where they are. the physical testing and evaluation needed, and then ultimately the athlete's primary goals. You might have an athlete that, athletes usually have, a lot of times might have some things they're great at, some things they need to work on. You might have a guy that's, agility-wise, they're above average, they're almost at the higher tier, whereas their size is a little too small, they need to put on some muscle. So again, matching in the athlete's primary goals with, with the sport's primary goals as well. And then next, obviously, you're gonna get into, exercise selection. First and foremost, we need core. So again, I know we often tie core with abs, but core is actually going to be associated with multi-jointed exercises. They involve the core. And the core is not just the abs. It's obviously everything in our core, our exoskeleton. We have our our lumbopelvic hip complex. We have our back. You have obliques. So it's a lot of things involved in core. But core is going to be multi-jointed movement. Those are our core, our base exercises. And then assistance exercises are going to be more single-jointed. And then you have structural versus power exercises. So structural exercises are going to be, stable, in place. Think of your bench press, your squat, your deadlift. Whereas power is going to be explosive, adding in a speed component. You might be leaving the ground. There's speed involved. You have, clean snatches, jerk press, things of the such. And again, it's important to understand, these things. And exercise selection, you want to definitely make sure you have. Same, and exercise and frequency and order obviously go hand in hand. I'll go into both of those and then go back to training frequency. But yes, exercise selection. So we talked about core versus assistance, stable versus power. So you always want to do your harder exercises and then your easier. What I mean by harder is what's more taxing on the body and more joints. So again, power and the explosive exercises are always going to go first. So power, and then other core exercises, and then accessories. So if I have a day where an athlete needs to get done a power clean, some arm work, bicep work, some squats, and then lat pull down, I'd probably organize that power clean first. It's explosive. Then get into our squat, multi-jointed, then our lat pull, and then our assistance bicep exercises. So always understand that power, then core, then assistance. There are various ways you can manipulate the order as well. There are some things you can do, and this kind of they all tie into each other, like frequency. So for example, we can do upper lower as a split. We can do push pull as a split, and then super compound and like supersets as well. So again, these things all depend on not only the skill level of the athlete, but also the training frequency. So for example, a beginner is going to train 2 to 3 times a week max, and you don't want to overdo it. So for them, it's obviously going to be, you have to incorporate a lot more per day, whereas an advanced athlete can train up to 7 days a week, and there you can get into more detailed splits, or maybe you focus on maybe assistance one day or some core another day. And an intermediate athlete is going to be about 3 to 4 days a week, so kind of in the middle. So obviously knowing that your frequency is going to depend on their level of training. Beginners can't go every day. And also your exercise selection and order for each exercise is going to depend on that frequency as well. You obviously can split up and do more isolated things if you're working out with somebody 6 to 7 days a week versus 2 to 3. So yeah, and again, when you're talking about also understanding what the frequency is in season versus out of season training. So obviously the strength coaches, in the off season, we're gonna have our most time with the athletes. They're not doing as much sport related things. So then they can do a lot more frequency as far as in the weight room and working with us. But in season, we're probably gonna see them less time. We're talking about 1 to 2 times, probably tops, especially for sports that have a lot of games per week, like a basketball or soccer or volleyball, things of the such. And you can see some of these things as far as frequency on table 6 on page 448. It talks about these things. And then, recovery time is obviously going to be based on the training load as well. So, more load, going to be more recovery needed. Obviously, heavier loads require more on the body to tax the body more, so we're going to need more recovery, both during the session. So as far as like, you're doing heavy power stuff, you're going to be resting a couple minutes compared to something more assistance-based or more endurance-based, you might be able to rest, 30 seconds or less. And again, understanding, the different types of orders, upper, lower, push, pull, compound, supersets. Supersets and compounds are only differ in that compound sets are going to be the same set muscle group, where supersets will be different. So a compound set could be a pull-up into a bend over row, whereas a superset would be a bench press into a bend over row, example. I always understand as far as training load and repetitions, we want to make sure we understand that load, also known as intensity, and reps or volume is going to be inversely related. So always understand that the more intensity you have, the higher the weight, the lower the reps have to be. That's just how it works. So typically how it's going to start early on is going to be lower intensity and the higher reps, getting that muscular-neural connection, teaching them how to move, getting more reps in, and as you progress, getting further along, more advanced, and especially closer to the season, especially with anaerobic athletes, it's going to eventually get to a point where it's a very high intensity and load, but very low volume. So understanding that, and measuring these things. You can also use rep max test to see where the athletes are, to know exactly where their percentages are for each rep and set. One rep maxes can be ideal, but if it can't be done, again, if somebody's a beginner, it's a power exercise that they don't really recommend one rep maxes for, then a multiple rep max test. They talk about these in table 17, 7, and 8 in the book. But also understand the proper one rep max protocol as well on the chart on page 453. So understanding how the warm up should be done leading up into a one rep max. And again, as I mentioned, like power exercises, you don't necessarily have to do the one rep max test. Speed or force, we're really worried about speed here. And so again, we can do more like 3 rep max or 5 rep max. Also important to understand when we're talking about just training low repetition and volume. We want to make sure with power-based, non-weightlifting exercises, 0 to 30% of your one rep max. So medicine balls, if you're doing, squat jumps, things like that, 0 to 30% of your one rep max on those max. Again, as far as progressing the training load and volume, easy one the NSCA likes to use is the 2 for 2 rule. So again, if they felt like they could have done if they felt like they could have done 2 more sets for 2 more reps for 2 more sets, it's time to progress them. So if they get to their last couple sets of an exercise at 10 reps, felt like they could have did 12, it's time to progress. So for upper body exercises, you typically want to increase 5 to 10 pounds, whereas lower body is more like 10 to 15 pounds. And then just understanding that volume is going to be based on the training goal. So as I talked about, maximal strength, so power-based, a high exercise, high sports like football, very power-based. Their volume is going to be lower because the intensity needs to be high. Whereas endurance athlete, a marathon runner, doesn't need to be doing 1 to 3 rep maxes a whole lot. They need to be doing more volume to get themselves prepared for their events. And then ultimately, finally, rest periods is going to depend on the training goal. Table 1712 on page 465 talks about this. And I also think, bioenergetics. So again, think about, what we're doing, understanding, is this anaerobic? Is this aerobic? Is it a combination of the two? So again, typically for more, when you're talking about more endurance-based exercises, you can rest less time. You can rest 60 seconds or less, or even 30 seconds or less if you're really on it. Whereas hypertrophy, you're going to get at least 30 seconds of training. Usually that's about 8 to 12 reps, at least 30 seconds of rest up to a minute and a half. When you're talking about maximal strength, when you're doing strength or power exercises, you're going to want to rest at least 2 or more minutes in between sets, because you have to recover more. It is more neural. So again, understanding that strength and power is going to be the most recovery, hypertrophy is going to be intermediate, and then muscular endurance is going to be the least amount of recovery. And then also understanding at the end of the chapter, they have a lot of exercises, making sure you, anything you don't thoroughly know or understand, making sure you're reading through them and getting it, because you don't want to miss a question on the test just because you are unaware of what the basis of what an exercise is. So make sure you're doing that. And again, really read through these charts. So again, the tables and charts in the book are very important. In this chapter, table 17.7 is very important, 17.6. Table 1711, 1710, 1712, those are some of the things we have in the notes. But honestly, I would say just browse through all of the tables, but those are some of the ones that are going to be more important. Ultimately, just understand, though, if you can understand those 7 variables, making sure you know what each one means, from needs analysis to exercise selection, training frequency, exercise order, training load and reps, volume, and then ultimately rest periods. If you know what each one means and those some of those basic factors, then you'll be just fine for the questions that come from that exam. So from that part of the exam, rather, it'll probably be anywhere from 5 to 10 questions there. It is an important chapter. So again, I would say read through it once, then go through these notes in the study guide. What we just talked about today, plus the questions we have in the study guide, will be more than enough. Just really make sure you understand those basic concepts, and if you do from there, and you'll be good to go. So again, check out the YouTube page for some more practical application videos for some technique as well. But most importantly, just make sure you breeze through these notes and understand those concepts, and you'll be good to go. All right, talk to you soon.